This happened back in my freshman year of high school. It was an average school day, just like any other for the most part. I remember I was sitting in my history class, which I think was the third period of the day. That's when somebody came to the door of the classroom with a note. I remember that at my high school, a couple of students would work for the office each hour and deliver passes to the students. The passes would usually be for things like dentist appointments or whatever. When the student got to art class, she handed the note to my teacher, Mr. Watterson. He read the note and then called my name. I was really surprised because I wasn't aware of having any reason to leave the school that day. I thought maybe I had forgotten about a dentist appointment or something. But my mother hadn't mentioned anything, and I knew she would have. When my name was called, I looked around and then got up and slowly walked to my teacher. He said something like, "See you later, pal. Here's the homework." Then he grabbed the assignment from his desk and handed it to me. I took the note, which also served as a hall pass, and left the classroom. I remember that's when I read the pass for the first time. The note said something like, "I will be here to pick you up for your appointment at 10:30. Mom? I guess I had an appointment of some sort, but it still seemed a little strange to me. I was happy to be leaving school. I walked through the empty hallways, making my way to the side entrance. There was a parking lot there, which is where people would get picked up by their parents. I got to the doors and went outside into the parking lot. There I saw a minivan, but it wasn't my mother's van. It was a different model and color. I figured it was somebody else's parent, and my mother wasn't there yet. The time was not quite 10:30, but I think it was like 10:28 or something. I don't remember exactly. I stood there looking around, waiting for my mother to arrive. Then I saw the minivan that was sitting there with the engine running. The front passenger's window started to roll down. I looked and saw a woman turn her head and look at me. We made eye contact, and I could tell that she was going to say something. Then she did. The woman said that she was there to pick me up and that my mother had asked her to. She then said that she was a friend of my mother. I had never seen this woman before in my life. Though I may not have been the brightest kid in the world, I sure wasn't that stupid. I was extremely skeptical. I asked the woman how she knew my mother exactly, and the woman replied, saying something like, "We're just old friends." I then told the woman that I didn't feel comfortable going with her and that I was going to wait for my mother. The woman tried to get me to just go into the van. I then turned around to head back into the school. This situation was starting to feel really sketchy. The problem was, when I got back to the side doors of the school, they wouldn't open. The doors were locked. I had forgotten that all doors to the school were locked during the school day, besides the front main entrance. Then things got worse. I looked back to the van to see a side sliding door start to open up. I wasn't aware that anybody else had been inside of it. A man emerged and started walking toward me. The van was maybe 50 feet away at this point. As I stood right outside the side doors of the school, I felt like my only option was to run away. I turned and ran around to the front side of the school. I didn't bother to look back at all to see if I would be chased. Back then, I could run pretty fast, and luckily, I made it around to the front end of the school pretty quickly. I kept running until I got to the front doors, and then walked inside. When you first got inside the front doors of the school, there was a little window where a woman sat during the school day. She would ask you who you were, and you had to show her your student ID or whatever. She asked me for my ID, and as I got it out, I tried to tell her about what had just happened. I must not have explained it very well though, because she seemed pretty confused. To be honest, the whole situation was pretty confusing. I got a hall pass from my mother to leave school for an appointment that I didn't know what it was. Then my mother wasn't there, but another woman was and asked me to go with her. Then a grown man popped out of the side of the van. Believe me, I was just as confused as she was. After confirming my school ID, the woman at the window wrote me a pass to go back to my history class, and I was on my way. I walked through the empty hallways of the school back to class, just about 15 minutes after I had originally left. I walked back in. My teacher was speaking, and there was a video paused on the board. I remember it was super awkward walking into the middle of class. Everybody was staring at me. They, as well as the teacher, were probably all really confused to see me return so soon after I had left. Back so soon? Mr. Watterson said. I just said, yeah. There was confusion, and I didn't have to leave. I then sat back down at my desk, and the lesson continued. Class only went on for about another 10 minutes after that, and then we were let out. My next period was English. This class was always pretty boring to me for some reason, but it was also fairly easy. I had Miss Gallo as my teacher, who was very nice. I got to class, and the day started like any other. But during this class, probably 20 minutes in, Miss Gallo got a phone call at her desk. She paused the lesson, answered it, and then hung up the phone. She told us that we were going into a lockdown and made it clear that this was not a drill. She seemed fairly concerned, and we all had to leave our desks and sit on the ground in the back of the classroom. We had no idea what it was about, and I truly had no clue either. I wasn't able to connect the dots for some reason. The lockdown went on for a good 30 minutes. Everybody was really quiet, and most people didn't say anything. Eventually, there was another phone call. Miss Gallo went over and answered it, then returned to inform us that the lockdown had been lifted. We were all relieved, and we finished up class, which didn't last too much longer. There was still another hour of school left at that point. By the time the school day was over, though, the word had spread, and I had found out what the lockdown was for. A man had walked into the school and completely surpassed the woman at the window asking for credentials. She asked him to stop, but he just blew past her without saying a word and walked into the school. He then disappeared into the hallways, and she had to call the office, which made the decision to lock down the school until the individual was found and identified. Unfortunately, he hid, and it took about 30 minutes to find him. The police had to be called. They found him hiding in the bathrooms that were right by my locker. The crazy part was that it was the same man who had come out of the minivan that had tried to pick me up. This story remains one of the craziest things to ever happen to me. The woman and the man must have somehow created the note for me and tried to get me to leave the school. Who they were and how they found me, I truly have no idea. It really freaks me out to think about that part. Luckily, nothing like that happened again. After getting off the bus, I quickly walked inside, hoping that the car would just drive away. When I got inside my house, I checked out the window, and the car was still there. I could see that somebody was inside, and it gave me a bad feeling. Not wanting to take any chances, I called my parents, casually asking when they would be home, hiding the anxiety in my voice. They mentioned that they would be a couple of hours, which did not help my situation. I didn't tell them about the car on the side of the street because I didn't want them to worry. I hoped that the car would drive away soon. Alone in the house, I hid by the window, peeking through the curtains. The car outside wouldn't leave, and it freaked me out. Trying to distract myself, I turned on the TV and put on a sitcom, but my eyes kept darting back to the creepy car outside. It just wouldn't leave. I decided that I wasn't going to look outside anymore. It wasn't doing me any good. Maybe 10 minutes passed, and I was just watching TV when I heard a door closing outside. It was a car door. I quickly looked back out the window again and saw a man getting out of the vehicle. He was wearing a red sweatshirt. I watched him walk right into our front yard. I ducked down and then ran away, sprinting from my bedroom. I got inside, closed my door, and hid under my bed like a little kid. I was terrified. My heart was racing, and I didn't know what to do. A few moments went by, and then I heard another sound. It was a knocking at my bedroom window that nearly made me jump. Immediately, I took out my phone and dialed 911. Whoever was there was definitely up to no good. I told the operator exactly what was going on, and I was told that the police would be there shortly. In the meantime, I wasn't hearing any noises, and the man had knocked on my window just the one time. Still scared, I remained hidden under my bed. I hoped that the man had gone away, but just as I was thinking that, I heard a sound of glass breaking coming from the other end of the house in the back. The guy had broken in. I heard more noise from that direction, and soon it sounded like somebody was inside. Then I heard another noise. Police sirens. This was the best sound I had heard all day. I heard the man inside the house turning around and leaving through the back the way he had come. Less than a minute later, the police arrived. Long story short, they actually caught the guy running away in the neighbor's backyard. The same man was also the cause of the lockdown at my school earlier. Apparently, he had somehow gotten inside the school, probably before it started for the day. Someone spotted him inside, and the school went under lockdown. I don't know how, but he was able to evade everybody and leave the school without getting caught, likely escaping out of an open window. I still can't believe how he ended up at my house of all places. It makes me think that possibly the guy was stalking me. Either way, I'm glad I don't have to worry about it anymore. This class was always pretty boring to me for some reason, but it was also fairly easy. I had Miss Gallo as my teacher, who was very nice. I got to class, and the day started like any other. But during this class, probably 20 minutes in, Miss Gallo got a phone call at her desk. She paused the lesson, answered it, and then hung up the phone. She told us that we were going into a lockdown and made it clear that this was not a drill. She seemed fairly concerned, and we all had to leave our desks and sit on the ground in the back of the classroom. We had no idea what it was about, and I truly had no clue either. I wasn't able to connect the dots for some reason. The lockdown went on for a good 30 minutes. Everybody was really quiet, and most people didn't say anything. Eventually, there was another phone call. Miss Gallo went over and answered it, then returned to inform us that the lockdown had been lifted. We were all relieved, and we finished up class, which didn't last too much longer. There was still another hour of school left at that point. By the time the school day was over, though, the word had spread, and I had found out what the lockdown was for. A man had walked into the school and completely surpassed the woman at the window asking for credentials. She asked him to stop, but he just blew past her without saying a word and walked into the school. He then disappeared into the hallways, and she had to call the office, which made the decision to lock down the school until the individual was found and identified. Unfortunately, he hid, and it took about 30 minutes to find him. The police had to be called. They found him hiding in the bathrooms that were right by my locker. The craziest part was that it was the same man who had come out of the minivan that had tried to pick me up. This story remains one of the craziest things to ever happen to me. The woman and the man must have somehow created the note for me and tried to get me to leave the school. Who they were and how they found me, I truly have no idea. It really freaks me out to think about that part. Luckily, nothing like that happened again. This story happened when I had to go to Saturday school. I guess that Saturday school was sort of like detention. I was in high school, and I think I was a junior. The way I got detention was that I forgot to return several of my school books. We were given books from the library that we needed for certain classes. When the semester was almost over, we were supposed to return the books on our own. However, I forgot, and I actually lost one of the books in my house. Eventually, I found it and returned all my overdue books, but I still had to go to Saturday school. It really wasn't that bad and was pretty much just like study hall. It was just one classroom, which was one of the language arts classrooms. The teacher just sat at his desk and made sure that we all behaved. Occasionally, he let us know what time it was and could answer some questions or help us with problems if he could. I remember that the teacher was Mr. Sanders. He was a nice guy and overall pretty reasonable. I remember that my mom dropped me off at the school just before 8 a.m. on Saturday morning. Saturday school started at 8 and went until 12. But not everyone had to be there the whole time. I only had to be there for 2 hours, so I would get to leave by 10. I know that depending on what some of the kids did to get Saturday school, they might have to write papers or something like that. Other kids just had to work on their own individual homework or study. I had to write a short paper on what I learned from not returning my books on time. I also brought a little bit of homework to do for another class. When I got there, there were only 4 other students. I recognized 2 of them, and the other 2 I didn't. They were not in my grade. The ones I recognized were both pretty much troublemakers. Kids who would skip class a lot or not turn stuff in. I felt sort of out of place because I was normally a really good student. At 8 a.m., Mr. Sanders shut the door and spoke to us for a few moments, then went behind his desk to work on his computer. I got to work and wrote the paper. It didn't take that long at all. Then I started doing my homework and finished that too by the time it was 9:30 a.m. Then I got a book from Mr. Sanders' bookshelf in the back and started reading. I remember that it was a short time after I started reading that Mr. Sanders got up from his desk and said he was going to the bathroom. He jokingly asked us all if we were going to be okay while he was gone. Then he left. A minute later, One of the other kids in the classroom got up and left as well. I wasn't quite sure what he was doing, but I didn't think too much of it. I just kept reading. But like 5 minutes later, the school intercom said that we were going under a lockdown. This seemed really strange. We all had no idea why we would be in a lockdown. There was hardly anybody at the school. It was a Saturday. Only one of the doors was even unlocked for people to come in on Saturdays. Most of us knew from lockdown drills that the classroom doors were supposed to be closed, locked, and the lights turned off. Then we were supposed to sit on the ground in the back of the classroom. The problem was that our teacher was gone. We looked around at each other, unsure of what to do. Then someone spoke up and said, "Shall we close the door?" We decided that we would. I walked over, closed it, and then locked the door. Someone else turned out the lights. We all started talking to each other, wondering what exactly was going on. If our teacher came back, we would let him in, but he most likely had keys with him. We weren't hearing anything from the hallways, but whatever the problem was could have been from anywhere in the school. A few minutes went by and nothing happened. Then somebody tried opening the door, thinking it might be the teacher. I got up and walked over to it, but by the time I got there and looked out, nobody was there. I went back and sat down at my desk again. We were really confused in the classroom now. Less than a minute later, it sounded like we heard some shouting in the distance. Then someone tried opening our classroom door, followed by more knocking on it. I walked over once again and this time looked out the small window. It was the kid who had been in our class earlier, but left. He was yelling and asking to be let in. I was just about to open the door for him when I heard more shouting coming from down the hallway. I heard somebody say, "Police," and the kid ran away from the door down the hallway. For several minutes, we were as confused as ever, but the lockdown ended about 5 minutes later, and several police officers knocked on our door. We let them in, and they explained the situation to us. When our teacher, Mr. Sanders, had left to use the bathroom, the other student left the classroom to follow him. The student knocked the teacher unconscious by punching him from behind. A janitor heard the incident, and then the student ran, which sent the school into lockdown, and the police were called. I'm glad that I didn't let that student back into the classroom. Mr. Sanders ended up being okay, but he had to go to the hospital with a minor concussion. I'm not sure what that kid's problem with Mr. Sanders was exactly, but I did hear that he had been suspended earlier in the year for fighting. That was the only time I went to Saturday school. Most of us knew from lockdown drills that the classroom doors were supposed to be closed, locked, and the lights turned off. Then we were supposed to sit on the ground in the back of the classroom. The problem was that our teacher was gone. We looked around at each other, unsure of what to do. Then someone spoke up and said, "Shall we close the door?" We decided that we would. I walked over, closed it, and then locked the door. Someone else turned out the lights. We all started talking to each other, wondering what exactly was going on. If our teacher came back, we would let him in, but he most likely had keys with him. We weren't hearing anything from the hallways, but whatever the problem was could have been from anywhere in the school. A few minutes went by and nothing happened. Then somebody tried opening the door, thinking it might be the teacher. I got up and walked over to it, but by the time I got there and looked out, nobody was there. I went back and sat down at my desk again. We were really confused in the classroom now. Less than a minute later, it sounded like we heard some shouting in the distance. Then someone tried opening our classroom door, followed by more knocking on it. I walked over once again and this time looked out the small window. It was the kid who had been in our class earlier, but left. He was yelling and asking to be let in. I was just about to open the door for him when I heard more shouting coming from down the hallway. I heard somebody say, "Police," and the kid ran away from the door down the hallway. For several minutes, we were as confused as ever, but the lockdown ended about 5 minutes later, and several police officers knocked on our door. We let them in, and they explained the situation to us. When our teacher, Mr. Sanders, had left to use the bathroom, the other student left the classroom to follow him. The student knocked the teacher unconscious by punching him from behind. A janitor heard the incident, and then the student ran, which sent the school into lockdown, and the police were called. I'm glad that I didn't let that student back into the classroom. Mr. Sanders ended up being okay, but he had to go to the hospital with a minor concussion. I'm not sure what that kid's problem with Mr. Sanders was exactly, but I did hear that he had been suspended earlier in the year for fighting. That was the only time I went to Saturday school. That's when his entire demeanor changed. Anger spread across his face as he stormed over to the waiting area, which was a room located between the ER and the front desk. As he walked away, I caught a glimpse of what he was dragging and quickly realized it was an axe. I panicked, but didn't want to raise any alarms. I almost called a code over the PA system, but instead opted to call the police on my cell phone. Then, I hurried down the hall to signal the nurses that we had a situation. The police would take about 20 minutes to arrive since they were coming from 2 towns over. We were all small women, and this man was tall and muscular. Even if we combined forces, we wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me, but I never received a response. Meanwhile, the man in the waiting area became increasingly agitated, eventually yelling and demanding help. I quickly hid from him. The nurses and I devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass was reinforced and the doors were heavy, so they should have held him there until the police arrived. The plan worked until the man realized what we had done. He started screaming, throwing chairs around the room, and then began using his axe on the door. We stood near the front desk, watching in terror. I've never been so scared in my life. He was actually making progress on the door. Just then, the emergency doctor returned from his break. He strolled in through the front entrance, still sipping on a drink. When he saw us huddled by the front desk, he immediately took charge of the situation. After gathering the necessary information, the doctor disappeared toward the back entrance, where the EMTs usually come in. He then unlocked one of the waiting room doors and tackled the man when he wasn't looking. The doctor bound the man's wrists with cable ties and sat on his back until the police arrived. I was so grateful to have a young, physically fit doctor with us that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think that will ever be enough. After this second incident, while working the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, I decided to never work late shifts again. Now, I'm on a Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. schedule, and I feel much safer. Last August, I was admitted to the voluntary psychiatric ward at the local hospital due to severe anxiety and depression. Unfortunately, it was my second hospitalization, but this time I would be sharing a room with another patient. When the psychiatric unit was built, for some reason, they decided to design double rooms, which meant that high-functioning patients often had to share. Since I had been there just a month earlier, the nurses all remembered me. Stays in the psychiatric ward typically last about 1 to 2 weeks. And because this was the voluntary ward, there were no actively psychotic or violent patients. My roommate, Jane, seemed like a quiet and unassuming person. She was small in stature and didn't seem to pose any concern at first. One of her favorite activities was sitting at her desk, working on crossword puzzles, and it appeared to be the only thing she did while in the room. Each patient gets their own desk and dresser, and I was admitted around 6 p.m. By 9:30 p.m., I had taken my medication and began meditating before going to sleep. As I focused on a beautiful picture of a tree and fence mounted on the wall, I noticed myself slowing my breathing and calming down. Then, something strange caught my eye. There was writing on the picture, etched in pencil. It read, "They are all liars. Liars." There were a few other things written that I couldn't fully decipher, but it made me feel uneasy. I assumed that a previous patient must have written it, so I decided to inform the nurses about it. If you've ever been in a psychiatric ward, you know that most of the time it's extremely boring. I spent most days walking around the ward, and some patients would even count their laps. I learned that 30 laps equaled 1 mile. I also spent time in the art room painting with a group of patients. However, after some time, I noticed that Jane never attended any of the group activities. In fact, she rarely left the room. Every time I returned, she was always at her desk, working on the same crossword puzzle. At first, I thought it was just her way of coping with boredom, but then I realized something odd. The crossword puzzle never changed. It was always the same one, and no progress was being made. It reminded me of the scene from The Shining, where Jack writes the same sentence repeatedly. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. On the second night, I came back to the room around 10:30 p.m. to go to sleep. Jane was still sitting at her desk working on the same puzzle, and the lights were still on. By this point, she had stopped responding to me altogether when I said hello or asked if she was going to join the group. Perhaps she was reacting to her medication or just didn't feel like talking. I turned off my light and closed my privacy curtain. The medication I was on knocked me out fairly quickly, but at around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a medical assistant asking Jane if she thought it was time to turn off the light or go to bed for the sake of her roommate. Jane didn't respond, and the lights stayed on. I just rolled over and went back to sleep. At some point, Jane must have turned off the light and gone to bed. But later, I woke up again, confused because my medication usually made me sleep for 12 hours straight. Then I heard someone talking. It was Jane repeating, "Jesse, help me. Jesse, help me." I asked her, "Jane, are you okay?" But she didn't respond. She just kept repeating the same words. At first I thought she was talking in her sleep, But later, when I woke up again, she was saying it even louder. This time I was sure she wasn't asleep. I tried to get her to respond, but she never acknowledged my presence. She just kept saying, "Jesse, help me. I need help." Not knowing what to do, I went to the night nurse, whose name was Jessie, and told her what was going on. When we returned to the room, Jane was hysterical, crying out for Jessie and trying to get out of bed. Jessie did her best to calm her down, and I was given more sedatives to help me get back to sleep. The next morning, Jane wasn't in the room, and a table that had been near her bed was now positioned in front of the bathroom curtain. When I went to use the bathroom, I discovered that an entire roll of toilet paper had been stuffed into the toilet. Once again, I went to find a nurse. As I stepped out into the hallway, I noticed two things. First, there was a medical assistant standing by the door near the front desk. Second, Jane was standing by the door as well. The door only opens when a call is made, so I was puzzled as to why someone needed to guard it. Later, I found out from another patient that Jane had spent the previous night running around the ward, throwing furniture. Security had been called to subdue her, and she had spent hours standing by the door like a statue. I went about my usual routine, painting and having breakfast. But later, I noticed Jane staring at me from outside the room. Whenever I looked up, she would quickly look away, but she wouldn't move from her spot for about 20 minutes. It made me uneasy, so I decided to return to the room. She followed me inside. At this point, I started to feel like things were getting out of hand. I informed the assistant at the front desk that I thought my roommate was following me around. While I was sitting with the assistant, Jane came over with 2 plastic bins full of my stuff, my iPad, my clothes, and even my pillowcase. I started to panic. The nurses were shocked. They said they had never seen anything like this before. I broke down in tears, and someone put an arm around me, saying, "It's going to be okay." To my horror, it was Jane. I asked her to stop touching me and asked the nurses to remove her from the area. Eventually, they moved me to a private meeting room and explained that Jane would be transferred to the involuntary ward later that day. Until then, I couldn't return to my room. While this was happening, Jane had moved to the back door leading to the stairwell, where she stood staring for hours. That evening, around 7 p.m., my husband came to visit, and we were playing cards with another patient. Jane was standing by the window, staring at me through the glass. I think she did it on purpose, so she could keep watching me. As we continued playing, 2 security guards and a psychiatrist arrived to move Jane upstairs. She refused to go, and when they tried to take her arm, she became violent, banging on the window and screaming for me to help her. They had to drag her upstairs, kicking and screaming. After that, I was assigned a new roommate, also named Jane, but she was very sweet and was only there to detox from medication. I felt much better after speaking with my psychiatrist, who reassured me that my reactions were completely normal. The next day, during our time in the garden, I saw my former roommate from the upstairs unit. I asked a supervisor if I could sit away from them during garden time, just to avoid her. She didn't approach me, but after we went back inside, she suddenly made a beeline for me, and once again had to be restrained. After that, I never saw her again. Something about me seemed to have triggered her, and I try not to think about what could have happened if she had remained my roommate. This is a story my mother told me when I was old enough to comprehend what almost happened to me. At the time, I was only a few weeks old, a vulnerable infant, oblivious to the world around me. It's strange to think how close I came to what could have been a life-altering event, one that still gives me chills whenever I hear it. Back in those days, it was common for midwives to visit a mother and her newborn at home after childbirth. My dad was out at work that day, as he usually was, and my mother had just put me down for a nap. Our home was peaceful and quiet, nestled in a small, close-knit community where crime was almost unheard of. Neighbors would be out working during the day, and the streets would fall into a sort of serene, deserted calm. Earlier that week, 2 midwives had visited our home, so when my mother heard a knock at the door, she was taken aback. She wasn't expecting anyone. Opening the door, she was greeted by a man and a woman, both wearing what seemed to be hospital uniforms and carrying identification badges. They introduced themselves politely, claiming they were from the hospital and had come to check on both my mother and me, her newborn daughter. My mother, seeing their professional appearance, didn't question them at first. After all, they knew her name, and they even knew I was a baby girl. Facts that made their visit seem all the more legitimate. The man informed my mother that he would go upstairs to check on me, while the woman would examine her downstairs. It was at that moment my mother's instincts kicked in. Something didn't feel right. She immediately told them that midwives had already visited earlier that week, and no one had informed her of another visit. She also mentioned that my father was due to come home soon, and he wouldn't be pleased about this unscheduled visit. The mood shifted quickly. The pair became defensive, their politeness melting into impatience. They insisted on their need to separate my mother from me, which only made her more suspicious. She was firm, saying she would call the hospital to confirm their visit. Her calm refusal to let them take me upstairs or separate us led to an uncomfortable back-and-forth exchange, but eventually they backed down. They adopted a more relaxed demeanor, saying there must have been a mistake, and began to leave. As they exited the house, something even more unsettling happened. My mother noticed a car parked outside, its engine running, with another person sitting in the driver's seat. It was as though they had planned an escape, ready to leave at a moment's notice. When my mother called the hospital, they confirmed her worst fears. No midwives were scheduled to visit that day, and they reassured her that it was against protocol to separate a mother and her newborn. What was even more alarming was the fact that the hospital did not have any male midwives on staff. The hospital urged her to contact the police immediately. Shaken, my mother called my father, who rushed home from work. Together, they reported the incident to the police, but as far as we know, nothing ever came of it. The identity and motives of those 2 strangers remain a mystery to this day. It's terrifying to think about what might have happened if my mother had trusted them, if she had let them into our home without question. They had clearly gathered enough information to know when my father wouldn't be home, and they even went so far as to acquire uniforms and badges to make themselves appear legitimate. But thanks to my mother's instincts, they didn't get the chance to carry out whatever sinister plan they had in mind. To this day, I shudder at the thought of what my life might have been like had my mother not followed her gut feeling that day. It's impossible to say what those 2 were truly after, but it's clear their intentions were far from innocent. We were incredibly lucky that they left when they did. Had they decided to use force, my mother would have been powerless to stop them. There's always a reason to be cautious, even in places that feel safe. His abusive behavior toward his girlfriend escalated to the point where her family had to intervene to get her out of that toxic situation. I stayed close to them, pretending to be on his side until we could help her escape safely. Eventually, they broke up, and he blamed me, claiming I poisoned her mind against him. Fortunately, she moved on and is now in a healthy relationship with someone else. We all blocked this psychopathic ex on every platform available, but he continued to harass them until he eventually seemed to disappear. Or so we thought. A year later, I started receiving strange messages on social media from various accounts. Each time, I blocked the account, but it became clear that they were all from him. Some messages were friendly, while others were hostile. But it was evident that all the accounts belonged to the same person. One of these accounts pretended to be someone I knew from university. We chatted for several days about life and general matters, and eventually I was invited to a house party. The account claimed the house would be empty, and many people would be attending, which sounded like an enticing offer. I took time off work and arranged all the travel details. In the days leading up to the party, I continued to communicate with this friend. One day, I mentioned the party to my friend's sister, who was interested in joining me. But when I told her the address, her expression changed instantly. She panicked because the address belonged to the crazy ex's father, who had the property up for sale. Feeling extremely anxious, I called the police and claimed there was a suspected break-in at the property. When the police arrived, they found 5 people inside the house, including the ex. What was even more terrifying was what they found outside. A butcher's van parked in front of the house, equipped for food storage, and inside they discovered knives, hammers, and ropes. That moment was indescribably horrifying. Then it happened again. The footsteps, this time faster, circled around the tent. It felt as though whatever it was knew I was watching. I aimed the flashlight toward the sound, but the light revealed nothing, only more darkness. My breath hitched, and then the footsteps abruptly stopped, right at the entrance of the tent. Kodak barked sharply, his voice cutting through the eerie silence like a warning. "Dad?" I whispered louder, shaking him desperately. This time, he woke up, groggy and confused. "What's happening?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes as he tried to make sense of what was going on. "Someone's outside," I whispered, my voice barely holding together. "Or something." He quickly sat up, the confusion in his eyes turning to alertness. He grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for chopping wood and gestured for me to stay behind him. We both listened intently. The wind had picked up again, rustling the trees, but the footsteps were gone. My dad slowly opened the tent flap, hatchet in hand, and we stepped out into the cool night air. Kodak had already darted out, sniffing the ground cautiously, still on edge. We scanned the area. Everything seemed in place. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that feeling, that heavy, oppressive feeling, remained hovering over us. "It's probably just an animal," my dad said, trying to calm me down, though his voice was tight with unease. We gathered more kindling and got the fire going again. The flickering flames pushed back the darkness, but not entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, like the forest itself was alive and waiting for something. We sat by the fire for a long time, not saying much. My dad tried to reassure me with a few jokes, but I could tell he was just as uneasy as I was. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of us, and he convinced me to try and get some rest. Reluctantly, I crawled back into the tent, Kodak lying close beside me, his warm body pressed against mine. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. I shot up, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I looked around the tent. It was empty. My dad was gone. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice trembling. There was no response. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled out of the tent, Kodak right behind me. The fire had gone out again, and the darkness felt even thicker than before. I called out again, my voice cracking with fear, but there was still no answer. Then I saw it, a movement in the trees. A figure, tall and shadowy, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was too far away for me to make out clearly, but I knew it was watching me. I could feel its cold, malevolent eyes fixed on me. I pointed the flashlight toward it, but the beam seemed to bend around the figure, as if the darkness itself was swallowing it whole. My blood ran cold, and I backed away slowly, my hands shaking so hard that I almost dropped the flashlight. Kodak barked again, his hackles raised, and the figure began to move toward us, gliding through the trees with unnatural speed. I turned and ran, my legs barely able to keep up with the terror surging through me. Kodak stayed close by, his growls echoing in the night. I didn't stop running until I burst into a clearing, panting and terrified. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. The forest was still again, but that didn't make me feel any safer. And then, I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind, calling my name. But it wasn't my dad's voice. It was something else, something wrong. I never found my dad that night. When the sun finally rose, the search party arrived, but they found no trace of him. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just an empty tent and a dying campfire. To this day, I don't know what was out there in the woods that night, but I do know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping again. When I was 18 years old, I felt like I was on the brink of a new and exciting phase in my life. I had just graduated from high school, and my dreams revolved around going to college and entering the workforce. However, things didn't go as I had hoped. Enrolling in college turned out to be a real challenge, along with the difficulty of finding a job in my area. These challenges left me feeling frustrated and anxious. Due to these circumstances, I decided to go to the job center, where I thought I might find some assistance. Upon my arrival, the staff there informed me that my shyness was the main barrier hindering me during job interviews. It wasn't easy for me to confront this issue, so they decided to include me in a group aimed at teaching interview skills. Unfortunately, this group was far from what I expected. I felt it was a waste of time and that I might have been placed in the wrong group, or that they had simply added me to increase numbers. The group consisted of older men, all at least 4 decades older than me. We didn't have much in common, and I felt uncomfortable talking to them. Among these men was one, whom I will call John, since I can no longer remember his real name. From the very first moment he walked in, he seemed to annoy everyone. During the instructor's introduction, John interrupted to complain about how useless the course was for him, emphasizing that he was about to retire and that no one wanted to hire someone who had spent over 10 years in prison. He didn't stop there. He shocked everyone when he claimed that he was convicted for beating his ex-wife. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He also insisted that his ex-wife was lying and that she didn't even have bruises during the trial. I felt uncomfortable because I realized it was unlikely that someone would receive over 10 years for an alleged assault that supposedly never happened. It was clear that John wasn't telling the whole truth, which made me decide to avoid him from that moment on. As time passed, I didn't interact much with the other men in the group either, as we didn't have much to talk about due to the age gap. I spent my lunch breaks alone in the library while the others headed to the pub. No one ever asked me where I was going during breaks, and since the pub and library were in completely different directions, it was hard for anyone to know where I was headed. Things took a strange turn about halfway through the course. One day, I ran into an old friend during my lunch break and decided to catch up with them instead of heading to the library. After our brief chat, I finally made my way to the library, where I spent about 15 minutes before borrowing some books. While I was chatting with the librarian about an upcoming movie related to the books I was borrowing, I suddenly felt hands gripping my shoulders. I hate being touched without warning, so I immediately pushed the hands away and turned around, backing into the librarian's desk. To my shock, it was John. He stood there smiling and made a joke about how he knew he would find me there since I practically lived in the library. This added more confusion to an already uncomfortable situation. There was no way for him to know I would be there unless he had been watching me during previous breaks. I hadn't even been to the library that day, so how could he possibly know I would go there after the session? The librarian, noticing my discomfort, asked if I knew John. When I briefly explained the situation, he politely asked John to leave me alone or exit the building. However, John refused, claiming we were friends despite my protests to the contrary. After some back and forth, John agreed to leave, but stationed himself right outside the doors, clearly waiting for me. The librarian, visibly concerned, suggested I stay inside until his shift was over so he could walk me to my bus stop. Unfortunately, I had another meeting that evening and couldn't wait, so I had to leave. As soon as I stepped outside, John immediately invaded my personal space again, joking about the librarian's problem and acting as though we were close friends. When I tried to walk around him, he grabbed my arm and insisted we go to a closer bus stop together, claiming we both took the same bus. This was news to me, as I had never seen him on my bus before. Reluctantly, I agreed, fearing he might follow me down the dark alleys if I tried to walk away. At the bus stop, John continued to act overly familiar, even suggesting we go for coffee together. I firmly told him no, but he kept pushing, eventually inviting me to his flat. His conversation became even stranger when he mentioned that if there was a naked girl on the couch when we arrived, I shouldn't worry, it was just his 18-year-old daughter. At this point, other people at the stop were staring, and I used the attention to firmly tell John I didn't want to go to his flat and to leave me alone. Thankfully, the bus arrived just then. I quickly got on, hoping for some safety, but John followed me and physically shoved me into the window seat, trapping me against the side of the bus. I loudly demanded he move and leave me alone, but he ignored me, continuing to invade my space and trying to convince me to visit his flat. Although a few passengers gave me uncomfortable glances, no one intervened, even when I shouted at him to stop touching me. He finally stopped after I made a scene, but continued to talk about his apartment. When we neared his stop, John pointed out his building and tried to give me a kiss on the cheek, which I dodged. He then waved at me through the bus window as it pulled away. Shaken and upset, I emailed the course instructor that evening, explaining what had happened and requesting to be moved to another group. Despite reading my email, she ignored it for an entire week until I threatened to involve the police. Her response was to allow me to leave the course early, essentially kicking me out instead of addressing the real issue. I bumped into John once more after that, and he tried to ask why I hadn't been attending the group anymore, admitting that he'd asked the instructor, but they refused to tell him. Thankfully, I managed to lose him in the crowd. I've seen him a few times in passing over the years, but he's never noticed me or tried to approach me again. I hope it stays that way. A few years ago, I was driving home when I had a strange experience. At the time, I was 23 years old, and I had just dropped my dad off at the airport for a late flight. After saying goodbye, I felt relieved to start my long journey home. It was already dark outside, and I still had 3 hours of driving ahead of me. The trip started normally, but after a couple of hours, my GPS recalculated my route and took me down a winding backroad highway. It was an eerie drive. There were no other cars on the road, just darkness surrounding me. As I turned around a curve, a black car suddenly appeared out of nowhere, tailgating me closely. My heart began to race as I felt increasingly uneasy. Then, just as I was processing the situation, I saw blue lights flashing behind me. Realizing that I needed to find a safe place to pull over, I continued driving until I reached a spot with a few small lights. It was difficult to stop in such darkness. When I finally pulled over, an officer approached my window. He asked if I knew my car's tags were expired. I was caught off guard because I was driving my mom's car, and she is usually very organized about those things. What really unsettled me was how quickly he spoke, as if he were in a rush. Before I even had the chance to show him my license and registration, his radio beeped. He quickly mentioned he had to respond to another call, rushed back to his car, and sped off. I sat there feeling a mix of relief for not getting a ticket, but also shaken by how odd the whole encounter had felt. I resumed my drive home, still feeling unnerved by what had just happened. The next day, I decided to check the car's tags, only to find out they weren't due to expire for another 2 months. While it could have been a simple mistake, the way the whole situation unfolded left me feeling uneasy. I wondered if he had misread the numbers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started to consider what could have happened if that person hadn't been a legitimate officer, or if he had bad intentions. Since that night, I've made it a rule to only pull over in well-populated areas. If I ever find myself in an isolated spot, I always call 911 first to let them know what's happening before I stop. That experience made me realize the importance of being cautious, even in situations that seem normal. A few days ago, I encountered a strange experience at the grocery store that still lingers in my mind. I was shopping with my toddler, who is just over a year old, on a weekend morning. The place was crowded, with many other families navigating the aisles, and the sounds mixed between children's laughter and the cashier's announcements. While I was picking out some fruits and vegetables, an older lady, perhaps in her 70s, approached me. She seemed kind and genuinely interested. She said, "Ma'am, just so you know, all the canned vegetables are on sale for 50 cents this week." She continued to talk about how this deal is not often available and how it would be a great idea to take advantage of it. I felt grateful for her tip, thanked her, and told her I would definitely grab some cans on my way out. As she turned to leave, she suddenly stopped, looked back, and smiled at my son. She asked me how old he was, and I replied that he was just over a year old. Then she started asking random questions about him, like whether he was my only child. Then, as if she just remembered something important, she said, "Hey, I just remembered that I have some clothes in my trunk. Boy stuff in the 2T to 3T range. Would you like them?" I felt a bit taken aback and politely declined, saying that we would be shopping for a while and I didn't want to hold her up. However, she didn't let it go easily. At that point, it really felt like she was trying to lure me and my son to her car. I kept declining and took a step back. I spent some more time shopping, trying to calm my nerves and browsing the aisles. At one point, I saw her standing in a central aisle of the store with a younger man, just watching people. Maybe I was being paranoid, and perhaps she was just a sweet old lady trying to help. But something inside me urged me to get out of that conversation as quickly as possible. As a parent, I understand that having a small child makes strangers more likely to approach you, often making small talk about your kids. But this conversation felt different from the others I had experienced while out with my son. After finishing my shopping, I couldn't shake the unease I felt. I thought about that lady, and whether she was genuinely nice or if there was something more sinister going on. I sat in the car after leaving, feeling relieved to have left that experience behind. Ultimately, I wanted to share my experience with others. Perhaps someone else has had a similar encounter. I feel that every parent would understand the need to be cautious, especially when it comes to children. So, I want to urge everyone to stay vigilant and be aware of their surroundings, because the safety of your children comes first. An incident at the ski resort. When I was 10 years old, I had a terrifying experience at a ski resort. I was there with my family, which included my dad, stepmom, and 3 sisters. We had a fantastic day skiing, playing, and enjoying the snow. But after a while, my sister Ava and I started to feel really cold. So, we decided to head back to the hotel to grab some warm food. We entered the hotel restaurant and sat at a table, waiting for our stepmom to come down. We chatted and laughed about our day, enjoying the cozy atmosphere. After a while, our stepmom arrived, and we asked her if she could hold the table while we quickly ran up to our room to drop off our ski jackets. We took the elevator to our floor, and when we got off, we started walking toward our room. That's when I heard a voice behind us say, "Fen." I didn't think the voice was directed at us, so I ignored it and kept walking. But just as we reached the door, something unexpected happened. Before we could close the door, a tall man appeared in the doorway. He looked to be in his early 60s and was wearing a hotel staff uniform, but it didn't have any logos on it. The thing that really made me uneasy was that he was wearing black surgical gloves. He then said, "Hey, I was talking to you." Ava and I were caught off guard and turned around. Ava nervously asked, "Us?" To which he replied, "Yeah, you guys. I was wondering if you could take a picture for me and come into my room to pour me some water." Even at our young age, we had been taught by our parents never to trust strangers. We immediately felt a bad vibe from him, so we politely declined his request. However, his tone shifted to a slightly annoyed one as he said, "Come on, it'll only take a second. Can you please just pour me some water in my room?" At that moment, we knew something was very wrong, so we said no again. The conversation went back and forth for about 3 minutes, and he actually tried to walk into our room. Our instincts kicked in, and I quickly ran toward the door, saying, "Sir, we're good." And then I slammed the door in his face. Ava and I sat in our hotel room for about 10 minutes, panicking about how we were going to leave and talk to our parents since we had left our phones downstairs. We peered through the peephole and saw that he was gone, so we bolted down the hallway and rushed down the stairs to the restaurant. As soon as we told our stepmom what had happened, she was horrified. Without hesitation, she went to speak with security. They interviewed us and asked for a description of the man since there were no cameras in the hallway. We provided them with the description, and they informed us that no one matching that description worked there. In fact, most of the staff were young college students who were struggling to make ends meet. In that moment, the reality of our situation hit us. If we had helped that man, we could have been in serious danger. I felt the urgent need to educate everyone about stranger danger, especially for children. And to that creepy hotel guy who didn't even work there, I pray and hope we never encounter you again, as this experience left a deep mark on my memory. This is a story about someone I thought was a friend, but over time I began to discover dark aspects of his personality that made me realize he was suffering from serious psychological issues. The story is not just about why I cut ties with him, but it evolves into one of those moments where you say, "I hope we never meet again." To protect privacy, I won't mention ages or locations. The story began about 4 years ago when I was living at a friend's house while attending a nearby university. It was a family home where my friend, his sister, and their parents lived. About 2 weeks into my stay, my friend's sister invited her boyfriend to move in with us as well. At first, he seemed like an ordinary person, even quite friendly. He was very sociable and full of interesting stories. We would often sit around the table, having drinks or talking about life while smoking in the garden. He seemed to fit into our social circle easily. However, within the first month, as he began to feel comfortable in the house, unsettling traits in his personality started to emerge. He would rant about government conspiracy theories and always portrayed himself as the victim in every situation. In addition to that, he was heavily influenced by the idea of the Sigma male and martial arts. Although these topics seemed strange, I initially thought he might just be a quirky individual. But things didn't stop there. He had a bad temper and an unstable personality. He also owned a large dog, which he kept caged at all times. This dog was known to be very aggressive whenever its owner was not around. One day, the dog attacked his girlfriend viciously, which forced her to make the tough decision to have it euthanized. After that incident, he began to impose feelings of guilt on her, and his rants became incessant. About 2 months later, he had the brilliant idea to move into a shipping container. This decision stemmed from the pressure from his parents to leave their home, and he convinced his girlfriend to move in with him. They rented a container in a storage yard on the outskirts of the city. Instead of living quietly, he started intimidating and harassing the staff there, until they eventually had to call the police. Naturally, he perceived this as another conspiracy against him. His abusive behavior toward his girlfriend escalated to the point where her family had to intervene to get her out of that toxic situation. I stayed close to them, pretending to be on his side until we could help her escape safely. Eventually, they broke up, and he blamed me, claiming I poisoned her mind against him. Fortunately, she moved on and is now in a healthy relationship with someone else. We all blocked this psychopathic ex on every platform available, but he continued to harass them until he eventually seemed to disappear. Or so we thought. A year later, I started receiving strange messages on social media from various accounts. Each time, I blocked the account, but it became clear that they were all from him. Some messages were friendly, while others were hostile. But it was evident that all the accounts belonged to the same person. One of these accounts pretended to be someone I knew from university. We chatted for several days about life and general matters, and eventually I was invited to a house party. The account claimed the house would be empty, and many people would be attending, which sounded like an enticing offer. I took time off work and arranged all the travel details. In the days leading up to the party, I continued to communicate with this friend. One day, I mentioned the party to my friend's sister, who was interested in joining me. But when I told her the address, her expression changed instantly. She panicked because the address belonged to the crazy ex's father, who had the property up for sale. Feeling extremely anxious, I called the police and claimed there was a suspected break-in at the property. When the police arrived, they found 5 people inside the house, including the ex. What was even more terrifying was what they found outside. A butcher's van parked in front of the house, equipped for food storage, and inside they discovered knives, hammers, and ropes. That moment was indescribably horrifying. For the most part, the night was quiet. The chickens and geese had rusted for the night, and the goats had lost the excitement of being in a new environment. They now huddled together in a corner of the living room. I would almost say it was peaceful, until every animal began screeching at the top of their lungs. The birds flocked around the house. The goats erupted in a panic, running around trying to find any hiding place they could. Most now cowered under the dining room table. Almost as quickly as the commotion began, it all quieted down. I looked at Uncle Jeremy in bewilderment, but the look in his eye told me he'd seen all of this before. His eyes trained on the door. A familiar sound slid across the other side of the door. It was the scratching that we'd heard the night before. In the same fashion, the scratching intensified before it erupted into a frenzy of banging. I eyed the door as the latch struggled to keep whatever was on the other side out. A voice soon followed suit. "Jeremy, Jeremy, Jeremy." "Oh, Uncle Jeremy." It sounded like me. For some reason, whatever was on the other side was using my voice to bait my uncle to the door. The voice changed to that of Uncle Jeremy's. "Marcus, open the door, Marcus." Uncle Jeremy looked at me before raising his revolver to the door. One shot rang out, and the sound of something hitting the floor was evident from our vantage point. My uncle took to his feet and made his way over to the door, revolver at the ready. I wanted to tell him to stay put, but couldn't find the courage. He opened the top latch, followed by the bottom. The door cautiously creaked open, and Uncle Jeremy peered out the small crack. I will remember the words that came from his mouth for the rest of my life. "Oh, shit." Suddenly, a clawed hand reached through the small crack in the door and pulled him from the comforts of the cabin. I heard screams but wasn't sure if they belonged to Uncle Jeremy or the thing impersonating him. Everything went quiet, and I wrestled with the idea of seeing what the outcome of the skirmish was. Just then I heard a voice that brought me a mountain of relief. "It's okay, kid. I got him." I heard Uncle Jeremy grunt as he seemingly took to his feet from the other side of the door. But as the door slowly swung open, my heart dropped. It wasn't my uncle. It was the creature that had taken him. Its body was tall and skinny, its skin pale, and its face, well, it had no face, just a plain identity. But as it stood there and turned in my direction, a mouth began to part, skin sticking to its upper and lower jaws until they eventually gave way to jagged teeth. It spoke one more time in my uncle's voice. "Marcus." It took to a sprint, and when it was just feet from me, a revolver round spat out. The creature flopped to the floor in a green pool of blood. Standing at the door was my injured Uncle Jeremy. For the time being, my brother is crashing on my couch to help us feel safer until we can meet with our landlord. We've collected evidence and ring footage to show just how far this has gone. I'm sure the landlord and police think we're just being dramatic, but we're not backing down. Either he goes, or we break our lease and get our full security deposit back. We're also looking into filing for a temporary restraining order, which some commenters mentioned might be quicker than going through the police. We met with our landlord last week, but unfortunately, they're not as willing to help as we hoped. They won't evict him from his unit. Instead of moving, we asked if we could switch to another unit in the complex. They offered us a one-bedroom apartment on the terrace level, meaning my roommate and I would have to share a room in what is essentially the basement. Not exactly what we wanted. We spoke with the police again, but they said the notes and letters weren't enough for stalking or harassment charges, especially since he lives just 3 feet away. He probably just thinks you're cute, they said. They took the ring video and promised to review it and get back to us this week. In the meantime, we've moved in with my parents. Shout out to them for being amazing. It's frustrating to pay over $2,000 a month for a place we can't live in, but we're actively searching for new apartments. Money is tight since we'd have to pay to break our current lease and start a new one. So while it's not the update we were hoping for, we're safe for now, and that's what really matters. If anyone has suggestions on how to raise $5,000 in a month, please let me know. My journey over the past 5 years. This is my story from the past 5 years. I'm currently 20 years old, and my ex, now my stalker, was 23 when it all started. For the sake of this story, I'll call him Alex. Back in early to mid-2019, I stumbled upon Alex's Instagram profile and immediately recognized him as a guy from my high school. I always thought he was attractive, so I followed him. To my surprise, he responded to one of my stories, and we started chatting. It quickly became clear that we had feelings for each other. Before long, we were calling each other and even falling asleep on the phone together. But one night, I woke up to hear him whisper something really disturbing like, "I would hurt you." I brushed it off, thinking I must have been dreaming. Eventually, we started dating, and for a while, everything seemed fine, until he would kiss me and bite me hard enough to draw blood. I told him multiple times to stop, but he wouldn't listen. A couple of months in, a girl posted a video on Instagram accusing Alex of cheating on her. He denied it and claimed he didn't even know her, and I, unfortunately, believed him. The breakup and stalking. After 10 months together, a friend sent me a screenshot of Alex being active on Tinder. That was the last straw. I broke up with him. A few months later, I started dating someone new, and that's when Alex went off the rails. He bombarded me with calls and messages, so I blocked him. But he didn't stop there. He began driving past my house every day. I had started my first job by then, but he found me there too. I even switched jobs, and somehow he still tracked me down. Things calmed down for a bit until I unexpectedly received pink roses with his name on the card. Being young and naive, I unblocked him and thanked him for the flowers. We ended up hanging out again, and before I knew it, we were texting regularly. My 17-year-old self thought it was cool to be dating an older, popular guy, so I fell back into the relationship. After a few dates, we started seeing each other again, and I eventually lost my virginity to him. The dark side of the relationship. Things took a dark turn. We were sleeping together regularly when one day he texted me saying he had a surprise. He sent me a file, and when I opened it, I found a video of us having sex. I had no idea he was recording us, but foolishly, I stayed with him, ignoring all the red flags. Eventually, the relationship became sexually and physically abusive. One night, while I was drunk and passed out, he had non-consensual sex with me, leaving bruises on my head and abdomen. A few days later, I finally had enough and broke up with him for good. The aftermath. After our breakup, Alex wouldn't stop texting and calling me, begging to see me. I refused every time, but he kept pushing. He even threatened to come into my house while I was sleeping, and this went on for months. I met someone new and started dating again. Since I was having trouble at home, my new boyfriend asked me to move in with him, and I did. Somehow, Alex found out where I was living and began showing up at our place. We started documenting everything and eventually filed for a restraining order. We were granted a temporary order until our hearing. When the hearing finally came, the judge extended the order for 6 months, warning that a long-term order would be issued if Alex violated it. Violation of the restraining order. Just days after the extension, Alex broke the order by parking in front of my house multiple times. I called the police, but they never even warned him. One day, while I was at work, I got a call from the police saying Alex had tried to buy a firearm, which violated the restraining order. They merely warned him not to do it again and informed me for my safety. In the following days, Alex started tailing me to work and swerving in front of my car. My boyfriend and I decided to move to a different place within the same city, but Alex managed to find us again. escaping the situation. Finally, my boyfriend decided that since the police weren't helping, we needed to leave the state. In the middle of the night, we packed our things and drove to another state where his family lives. We've been here for about 2 months now and have found good jobs. We plan on leasing our own apartment soon. Life has been mostly peaceful, but I still hear updates about Alex from back home. He's telling everyone that we're still together and even posting pictures of me on Instagram. My story isn't over yet, but I'm determined to move forward. When I was 18, I moved to South Africa to live with my dad. Being British, this was a huge change for me, and of course, I had my fair share of teenage angst. My dad lived near the airport in Johannesburg and often traveled for work, which meant I spent a lot of time on my own. Sometimes he was away for a month, and other times for up to 3 months. I managed my own shopping and did some light cooking, but since I didn't drive yet, I walked everywhere. My dad didn't set many rules for me, but he had one important guideline. Don't go out alone at night. He didn't mean just staying in the yard, as we lived in a gated community with a security guard at the entrance. What he really meant was not to leave the neighborhood after dark, because it wasn't safe, thanks to the risk of robbery. I heard him, but I didn't take it too seriously. It got pitch black by 6 p.m., darker than any night I'd ever experienced in London. Without streetlights, it felt like complete darkness. One evening around 7 p.m., I got a craving for some crisps, or potato chips, as my American friends call them. After being home alone for 2 weeks, I was bored and decided to break my one rule. The security guard tried to stop me when I told him I was going out. He even offered to buy the crisps for me after his shift. But I was nearly 19, tall, and full of bravado. I wasn't scared. The road from my dad's house was well lit, and the store was only about a mile away. However, there was a dark avenue I had to walk through, lined with trees and no lighting at all. Just pitch blackness. A cold wind blew, and the sounds of insects and birds felt amplified in the silence. That's when I heard footsteps. I glanced back but didn't see anyone, so I kept walking, trying to convince myself I was just imagining things. A little further along, I heard the footsteps again, but still couldn't see anyone. I was walking in the middle of the road, thinking it was safer. But then I realized the footsteps were coming from the path beside me. I quickened my pace and started singing loudly, hoping to drown out my fear. But the footsteps continued, making my anxiety grow. To reassure myself, I stopped and turned on my phone's flashlight, pointing it toward the path. To my horror, I saw a man peeking from behind a tree. He looked about 30 and was watching me intently. I swear he had something in his hand. It looked like a knife, but I couldn't be sure. Panic set in, and I turned around and ran home as fast as I could, barely listening to anything around me. My heart raced, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The security guard heard me coming and had the gate open before I even reached it. He looked at me knowingly as I panted, trying to catch my breath. He didn't ask me about it, but I could tell he understood what had happened. I never saw that man again, and I often wonder what could have happened if I hadn't run. I didn't tell my dad or anyone else about it. Oh, and by the way, the security guard did get me the crisps. After that night, I decided it wasn't worth the risk, and I never went out alone at night again. A troubled friendship, the stalker among us. Back when my friends and I were in our early teens, we spent a lot of time hanging out at a local park in town. That's where our story begins, with a kid around our age who had a strange way of making friends, stalking. His technique was to follow people around for days or even weeks until he got noticed or just gave up. He blended in by simply being around us, so we had no idea we were being watched. If we noticed anything at all, it was that he was just a familiar face in the background, enjoying the same spaces we did. Eventually, we invited him to join us in a game, completely unaware of his intentions. Before long, he was part of our group. We'd invite him to hang out and look for him in the park whenever we could. We spent a couple of years together, especially during our free time when school was out. Sure, he had his quirks, but we didn't mind. Having another friend was fun. He even eventually confessed that his stalking was how he made friends. At the time, we laughed it off. His actions seemed odd, but not alarming since we were all around the same age. We didn't recognize it as a red flag. After all, he wasn't an adult, so there wasn't a clear sense of danger. We had a lot of normal moments and good times, but as we grew closer, things started to get complicated. One of the first red flags was his tendency to overshare personal information. While sharing struggles isn't inherently bad, it revealed he had a troubled childhood with issues at home and school. It became clear that he had made some questionable choices at a young age. Looking back, we realized his upbringing probably influenced his odd behavior, but that didn't excuse it. Over time, his behavior became more problematic. He wasn't just quirky. He could be mean and rude, especially to those he was closest to. He often crossed the line from playful teasing to outright cruelty. One notable incident involved him getting into a fight after using a racial slur against another kid. As his creepier tendencies emerged, we noticed he was desperate for romance. He tried to date multiple people in our group or acquaintances, often leading to unwanted advances. This wasn't just with romantic interests, it extended to friendships as well, creating tension within our circle, especially when he pursued relationships that weren't reciprocated. One particularly concerning incident occurred when he nearly obtained the address of a girl he liked. Fortunately, it ended up not happening, but it wasn't hard to see how this could have escalated into something much worse. The peak of his stalker-like behavior came with his obsession over a girl in our friend group. He engaged in all sorts of unsolicited contact, from playing with her hair to forcing himself into her space and getting jealous of her interactions with other guys, despite them not even dating. She made it clear that she didn't want any of that, but he didn't take the hint. The situation hit a breaking point when he sent her explicit material, trying to persuade her to come over. This prompted her to involve the police. We never learned exactly what happened afterward, but it took him out of our lives for a while. After that, he stopped talking to most of us, only reaching out occasionally to a few people he still saw at school. Eventually, he moved away, and we lost contact altogether. Some of us decided to cut ties with him due to his increasingly problematic and arrogant behavior. We heard through mutual friends that his life took a downturn, even though it initially seemed like he was doing better. While some of his actions could be traced back to his troubled background, that doesn't excuse the rude and creepy things he did. We can only hope he has since recovered and improved his behavior in his new life. as he seemed to be making progress during our last brief encounter. My friends, I hope you like this video and have a lively time. I was 14 years old when this strange story began. It was early 2020, during my freshman year of high school. In my third period biology class, we were assigned a seating chart, which placed me next to two of my close friends. They sat in the row right next to me, and we would chat and exchange stories like any other high school students. Sitting in front of me was a boy whose name I didn't know at the time. He seemed quiet and withdrawn. I never paid him much attention, not even when he passed me in the hallways. He rarely spoke during class unless the teacher called on him, and even then, his voice was barely audible. I had never had any conversation with him, except for the occasional "excuse me" when I passed by his desk. However, there was one thing that stood out to me. He always kept a Bible on his desk, and sometimes he would read it instead of paying attention to the class. This wasn't particularly shocking, considering we were in the southern United States where many people are Christians, including myself. But something about it felt odd. Maybe because he seemed so distant from everything else going on in class. The first month of the semester passed quietly. I was busy talking with my friends about simple things like weekend plans or school activities. I wasn't thinking about the boy who sat in front of me. However, about 4 weeks into the semester, I received a surprising text from a more distant friend who was also in the class with me. She told me that had asked for my number after class. At first, I was confused as to who she was talking about, but when she explained that it was the boy sitting in front of me in biology, I became even more puzzled. I had never spoken to him, so why did he want my number? Before I could even tell my friend not to give him my number, it was too late. A message from an unknown number appeared on my phone, and it was him. He introduced himself politely, apologizing for not asking for my number directly, saying that he was too shy. At first, I thought it was innocent and maybe even a little sweet. But things quickly took a strange turn when he started telling me that he had been listening to my conversations with my friends in class, that he had fallen in love with me, and that he believed God had sent me to be with him. At that moment, panic set in. The idea that he had been eavesdropping on my private conversations made me feel uncomfortable. However, I was too scared to tell anyone about it. This was my first experience with something like this, and I didn't know how to handle it. In a moment of fear, I blocked him and tried to move on. But that night, my phone kept buzzing with notifications, all from the same unknown number. I knew it was still trying to convince me to talk to him and go out with him. Fortunately, after that night, the messages stopped, and with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, everything seemed to settle down. We transitioned to online learning, and I was 14 years old when this strange story began. It was early 2020, during my freshman year of high school. In my third period biology class, we were assigned a seating chart, which placed me next to two of my close friends. They sat in the row right next to me, and we would chat and exchange stories like any other high school students. Sitting in front of me was a boy whose name I didn't know at the time. He seemed quiet and withdrawn. I never paid him much attention, not even when he passed me in the hallways. He rarely spoke during class unless the teacher called on him, and even then, his voice was barely audible. I had never had any conversation with him, except for the occasional "excuse me" when I passed by his desk. However, there was one thing that stood out to me. He always kept a Bible on his desk, and sometimes he would read it instead of paying attention to the class. This wasn't particularly shocking, considering we were in the southern United States where many people are Christians, including myself. But something about it felt odd. Maybe because he seemed so distant from everything else going on in class. The first month of the semester passed quietly. I was busy talking with my friends about simple things like weekend plans or school activities. I wasn't thinking about E, the boy who sat in front of me. However, about 4 weeks into the semester, I received a surprising text from a more distant friend, who was also in the class with me. She told me that E had asked for my number after class. At first, I was confused as to who she was talking about, but when she explained that it was the boy sitting in front of me in biology, I became even more puzzled. I had never spoken to him, so why did he want my number? Before I could even tell my friend not to give him my number, it was too late. A message from an unknown number appeared on my phone, and it was him. He introduced himself politely, apologizing for not asking for my number directly, saying that he was too shy. At first, I thought it was innocent and maybe even a little sweet. But things quickly took a strange turn when he started telling me that he had been listening to my conversations with my friends in class, that he had fallen in love with me, and that he believed God had sent me to be with him. At that moment, panic set in. The idea that he had been eavesdropping on my private conversations made me feel uncomfortable. However, I was too scared to tell anyone about it. This was my first experience with something like this, and I didn't know how to handle it. In a moment of fear, I blocked him and tried to move on. But that night, my phone kept buzzing with notifications, all from the same unknown number. I knew it was E, still trying to convince me to talk to him and go out with him. Fortunately, after that night, the messages stopped, and with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, everything seemed to settle down. We transitioned to online learning, and I no longer got. A short while later, I received one last email from E. In it, he wrote, "Thank you for telling everyone what I sent you. I'm glad you did so. It doesn't matter why you did, but God works everything for good." That was the final message I received from him, and I felt a bit of relief knowing that the situation had come to an end. A year later, as I was about to graduate, I received one last update about E. I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw a post from his mother asking for help finding him. He had run away from home, and the only thing he took with him was his Bible. To this day, he still hasn't been found, and even though it's been a while since I last heard from him, it's unsettling to know that he's out there somewhere. In the fall of 2006, I was 15 years old, and that year left a permanent mark on my memory due to an incident that changed my perspective on the world. About 11 months earlier, I had moved from the Dominican Republic to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I began a new life filled with challenges. The transition was a big adjustment for me, not just because of the cultural shock, but also because of the language barrier. At the time, I wasn't fluent in English, which made interacting with people an exhausting task. Since I was young, people always told me I looked older than my actual age. Maybe it was because of the scars on my face or the fact that I was bald at a young age. Back then, I was about 5'8", and this made me look older than I really was. Some even thought I was 20 years old. But regardless of my appearance, I was still a teenager trying to adapt to a new life in a completely different environment. We lived in one of Milwaukee's worst neighborhoods, a place known for violence and crime. It wasn't unusual to hear gunshots and shouting at night, but despite that, I never truly felt like my life was in danger. Things seemed to be going relatively normally until that fateful day. I vividly remember that it was in early November. It was freezing cold, as is typical in the Midwest at that time of year. One night, around 9 p.m., my mom asked me to go to the nearby liquor store to buy some snacks and food for the next day. It was clear that my mom had had too much to drink that night, as she gets drunk easily, and maybe she wasn't fully aware of the danger of sending me out so late. She gave me $25 and her food stamps card and asked me to hurry. The store was about 9 blocks away, which meant I had to walk for about 10 minutes to get there. I didn't feel safe walking through the neighborhood at night, especially with that amount of money in my pocket in such a violent area. On top of that, I wasn't fluent in English yet, as I had only been learning it for 4 months, so communicating with others was still a big challenge for me. When I arrived at the liquor store, the place was nearly empty, except for 2 other teenagers around my age. They were talking to each other, but as soon as I walked in, they both stopped and stared at me in a way that made me uncomfortable. I had a feeling they were planning to rob me. Their stares made it pretty clear. Let me describe what they looked like. The first teenager was short, about 15 years old, African American, wearing worn-out Timberland boots, baggy blue jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and an orange jacket. He had a small afro and was around 5'3". I felt like I could overpower him if things got physical. The second teenager looked older, around 17 years old. He was also African American, wearing black Adidas sneakers, baggy pants, a black Iverson shirt, and a white t-shirt underneath. He had a 90s-style flat-top fade, which made him look a little taller than me, maybe due to the height of his hair. Both of them were staring at me in a way that made me feel unsafe. I spent about 3 or 4 minutes in the store, trying to pick out some snacks and drinks. I had $25, and I wanted to make the most of it. I expected them to leave, but they didn't. They just stood there, not shopping for anything. Their behavior felt strange, as if they were waiting for the right moment to make a move. As I walked past them to open the fridge and grab a drink, one of them whispered to me, "Give me your money." Even with my limited English, I understood what they said. But I tried to stay calm and told them, "Sorry, I don't have any money." In broken English. It seemed like they didn't fully understand me either because of my poor language skills. Things quickly escalated when the older teenager angrily whispered, "I said, give me your damn money." At that moment, I realized that the situation was about to take a dangerous turn. The store clerk wasn't paying attention, and it felt like time was slowing down. I was scared and didn't know what to do. I decided to leave everything behind and walk out of the store quickly. As I was leaving, I noticed that they were clasping their hands together as if they were praying. That strange gesture was a clear sign that I needed to get out of there as fast as possible. I started speed walking down the sidewalk, heading toward a nearby grocery store about 4 or 5 blocks away. Fear gripped me, and I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid they might be following me. In a moment of panic, I made a huge mistake by deciding to take a shortcut through a narrow, dirty alleyway. As I walked through the alley, I suddenly heard someone shout, "Hey, we're gonna kill your ass." I didn't understand every word, but I could tell from the tone that they meant harm. When I turned around, I saw the same two teenagers approaching me. They were about 70 feet away, and the shorter one pulled out a gun and fired 2 shots at me. At that moment, adrenaline surged through my body. I was terrified and started running as fast as I could. I could hear them chasing after me, but they didn't fire any more shots. I kept running until I reached a nearby Popeyes, about 8 blocks away. I rushed inside, not caring about the strange looks people gave me. I ran into the bathroom, hid in one of the stalls, and tried to process what had just happened. I sat in the bathroom for about 30 minutes, trying to calm down. I was afraid they might have followed me into the restaurant. After some time had passed, I gathered the courage to come out. The cashier asked me if I was okay, and foolishly, I said, yes. Looking back, I realize now that wasn't the right response. After leaving Popeyes, I found an abandoned bike near one of the alleys and rode it home as fast as I could. When I got home, I tried to act normal. My mom, still drunk, asked where the food was, and I simply told her the store was closed. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I considered telling the police or my mom, but I ultimately decided to keep it to myself. I didn't want to worry her, and I didn't want to get involved with the authorities. After that incident, I continued going to the same store, but only during the day. I never saw those teenagers again, and I made sure to avoid any similar situations. About 7 months later, I moved to a different part of Milwaukee. Over the years, I never encountered that terrifying experience again, but it taught me a lot. I became more cautious and more aware of the environment I lived in. My first encounter with this person was when I was 11 years old. I was living in a quiet neighborhood, and one sunny day, my friend and I decided to go to the park down the street from my house to play. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, and the air was fresh. While we were racing and climbing on the playground equipment, I noticed an older boy riding his bike. He passed by us several times, but I didn't think much of it at first. However, on the 4th time around, he stopped his bike and came into the park. He approached us and pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket, extending it towards me while saying, "This is for you." He looked to be at least 15 years old or more, which made me feel a bit uneasy. I took the paper and watched as he rode away on his bike. I exchanged a confused glance with my friend, and as I opened the folded note, I saw an address along with a message that said, "Come to my house for a surprise, Jay." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. My friend and I dropped the note and ran back to my house immediately. We thought perhaps this kid was just trying to make friends, but something about the note made us very uncomfortable. From that day on, we would occasionally see him riding his bike around the neighborhood, so we assumed he lived nearby. A year or two later, I had another encounter with him. I was walking home from that same friend's house. Her place wasn't far. It took me less than 10 minutes to walk home. As I was walking, I noticed someone on a bike in my peripheral vision. I immediately thought back to that boy and looked over to see if it was him. I couldn't recall his face very well, but when I looked, I recognized him instantly. He was staring at me, but thankfully, he just rode past me without stopping. Relieved, I continued on my way home. However, as I was about to open my front door, I heard someone yell, "Hey!" I turned around and saw the boy on the bike, now waving at me. I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me and rushed inside to tell my parents. They brushed it off, suggesting he might just be autistic. I felt a bit guilty, thinking that maybe he just wanted friends and lacked social skills. But still, why would he follow a young girl home if he was just trying to make a friend? My third encounter with him was when I was walking to the store. When I reached the corner next to my street, I saw him standing in the middle of the grassy divider. I tried to walk past him, hoping he would leave me alone, but he started to approach me. "What's your name?" he asked, his curiosity evident. "Hannah," I replied, lying. By this time I was around 13, and he looked to be at least 17. I turned to walk away from my house because I didn't want him to know where I lived. He asked where I was going, and I lied again, saying I was going to a friend's house. "Where's your friend?" he inquired, but I avoided the question. Then he stepped closer and asked me to come with him. "I'm sorry, I can't. I'm going to my friend's house," I insisted. "You really need to come with me," he said, pushing me further into panic. My heart began to race, and chills ran down my spine. "No, I have to go. I'm sorry," I replied, starting to walk away. He lingered a bit, but clearly continued to follow me. I was now frantically trying to think of a way to get back to my house without him seeing where I was going. I started walking toward the church down the road when suddenly a car pulled into the cul-de-sac. The car stopped near him and the window rolled down. I looked over and saw a woman talking to him. I had no idea if they knew each other, but I didn't care. I took that opportunity to get away. I spun around and darted back home, running faster than I ever had in my life. When I finally made it inside, I was desperately trying to catch my breath. My dad asked me what had happened, and I explained everything. He agreed it was creepy, but doubted the boy had any malicious intentions. Once I started high school, I occasionally saw him outside one of the buildings with a group of people, but thankfully, he never approached me again. I found it strange that the note he gave me had his name as Jay, but during his graduation ceremony, he used a completely different name. My last encounter with him was just last year. Once again, I was walking to meet my friends at the church down the street. As I was walking, I saw him again, and I felt a wave of nerves wash over me. By that time, it had been years since I had last seen him. I immediately called my friends to let them know what was happening so they could come quickly, as he was following me again. He didn't catch up to me, but I could see him trailing behind the entire way. As soon as I crossed the street to get to the church, he disappeared. Luckily, my friend's car was already there, so I quickly got inside and explained what had just occurred. Since then, I have moved, so I hope that was the last time I ever see him. Part of me still feels guilty because maybe he was genuinely trying to make a friend, but regardless, the experience terrified me. I moved in with my uncle, who had a strange set of rules. When I was 12, I was forced to spend a summer with my great-uncle Jeremy. You see, I was a bit of a troublemaker back in those days, and my parents thought if I spent some time with my strict grouch of an uncle, I would somehow be rehabilitated. You can imagine how hard my eyes rolled when my mom and dad told me about their plan, but I was oblivious to the horrors I would endure that summer. Uncle Jeremy was somewhat of a mountain man. He lived in the remote wilderness of Montana's high pine forest. A homesteader through and through, he'd made a life where most people would go insane. Granted, Uncle Jeremy did seem a bit kooky to me at the time. My dad almost tossed me out of the car as we rolled into my uncle's mountain cabin. He didn't even wait for Uncle Jeremy to greet me at the door. I watched as Dad's little Prius made its way back down the long driveway and onto the unkempt dirt road. While I was a bit offended by how I'd just been abandoned, I was not envious of the long journey ahead of him. It took us almost 2 hours to traverse that nasty road. I was sure we'd be left stranded at one point or another. A Prius is no off-roading vehicle. The hybrid's taillights disappeared amongst the dense forest. My attention turned to the rickety wooden cabin. This house was not what you would imagine it to be. It wasn't the picturesque idea people have when they think of a log cabin. I could see the structure had been through a lot. The logs were weathered, faded by the hot Montana summer and the icy winter winds. I could tell that everything used in its construction was sourced from the surrounding forest. Likewise, no modern amenities were visible. No power lines, fire hydrants, not even a satellite dish. I knew then it was going to be a duller summer than I'd imagined. I lifted a hand to knock on the old door and stopped when I noticed a few deep scratch marks on its facade. Bears? I thought to myself. An uneasy feeling that I was being watched from the pines came over me. I cocked my head in the direction of the tree line. It felt like something was calling me over to the woods. The door squealed open, and I returned my gaze to the cabin. In the passageway stood a gray-bearded man, the fibers in his beard long, greasy, and matted. His skin was old and weathered. I suspected the same reasoning as the cabin's. He looked at me through the gray film in his eye. I'd never actually met Uncle Jeremy up until that point, but I'd heard stories about him from my father. My father had suffered the same fate as me the summer between 7th and 8th grade. He told me Uncle Jeremy was not a man to be trifled with. You listen to everything your Uncle Jeremy tells you. He is not a man you want to make angry. My father would lecture. But when I looked into the face of the withering man, I didn't sense an ounce of animosity. He almost seemed kind. Nothing resembled the ferocity my father had mentioned. "Hi, I'm Marcus." I outstretched my hand in the introduction, but he slapped it away before placing a hand over my mouth. "Shh, we don't say names here." He moved my head over to the side to make sure no one or nothing was listening. More of my father's description of my great-uncle came to mind. Uncle Jeremy, his name. "Damn it, kid. I told you no names," he said through gritted teeth before returning his gaze to the tree line. Almost like a dream, a faint voice slithered into the cabin. "Jeremy," the voice called. "What the hell is that?" I asked, but received no reply. Uncle Jeremy quickly slammed the door shut. "Rule number 1, no names." I dropped my gaze at his reprimand. "Rule number 2, if you hear something strange, leave it be. Ignore it. You hear me?" I ponder his instructions before moving to question his logic. "What?" "Not another word on the matter. Those are the rules. My only rules, you follow them or I'll send you back to your little life in Boise, you hear me?" Just then my escape from homestead living became clear. break a few rules here and there, and I'd be back in the gem state. I tried not to smile at the plot that was formulating in my mind. Your room is down yonder. The old man pointed down a small hallway before leading me to it himself. We stepped into a small 10 by 10 room. I threw my backpack onto the bed and plopped down right beside it, giving a grunt of relief. What do you think you're doing, kid? This isn't some luxurious mountain retreat. I eyed the crumbling wooden walls. The understatement of the century, I thought to myself. We have work to do. He moved to the window and pushed open the shutters, taking in a lungful of pristine mountain air in the process. Beyond his gaze stood a 2-acre clearing in the forest. A mix of fields, more comparable to glorified gardens, and livestock, chickens, goats, and 1 cow. He turned to me and noted my disappointed face. What, you think this was a free ride? No, we work for our food here, he said with the first ounce of enjoyment I'd seen inch across his face. He pulled open a drawer on the nightstand. I placed these here for you before you got here. I peered into the drawer to find some old torn overalls. You put those on and meet me outside. There's a lot to get done around here. The faster we get it over with, the faster we can have ourselves a nice supper. Later that night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. All of my muscles were aching. Uncle Jeremy was not lying. Homestead living is not for the weak. We'd worked until the sun met the horizon, and this time of year in Montana, that was around 9:30 p.m. We'd weeded the fields, fed the chickens, and milked the dairy cow whose name I found out to be Bessie, and done dozens upon dozens of other tasks that were not very enjoyable. The best thing about it was that Uncle Jeremy said we would do it all again the next day. I placed the pillow over my face, hoping that it would suffocate me. I was a beat dog that needed to be put out of its misery. The warmth of the plush fabric seemed to comfort me a bit, so I left it there as the night slowly started to wash over me. Just as I was about to fall into an uneasy night of sleep, I heard scratching from the other side of the wall. It was coming from outside. The sound was very faint. It almost reminded me of the time we had mice inside the walls back home. Only these walls were not hollow, they were solid lumber. I moved the pillow off to the side, making sure that nothing muted the scraping by my head. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The noise sounded rhythmic, almost as if someone was sending a message. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was clawing deeper into the... What was making the noise was too strong to be a mouse, a raccoon maybe. Then the sound intensified to a loud, ear-piercing screech, like someone clawing at an old chalkboard. Screech, screech, screech. I shot to a seated position. It must have been a bear. Montana grizzlies scared the shit out of me, part of the reason why I'd never come to meet Uncle Jeremy in the first place. I heard the same faint whisper that had come from the tree line earlier that day. Only this time, instead of Uncle Jeremy's name, my name hissed in through the cracks of the cabin. Marcus. I looked at the shutters on the window, and my heart dropped when I saw something slowly pulling them open. Uncle Jeremy? I shouted. From down the hall, I heard a bedroom door smash a door. Uncle Jeremy stood there holding his .22 in hand, his eyes meeting mine, before noticing the slowly creeping shutters. He leaned the gun on the wooden wall before running over to the shutters and forcing them closed. He quickly locked the latch before turning to me. Kid, I had 2 rules, and you broke both of them the first night. He shouted at me while I still trying to make sense of what just happened. I was hoping that the more my uncle talked, the more the situation would clear up, but everything he said just made me more confused and frankly terrified. Now you've done it, kid. It now knows our names. It's imprinted on us. You have no idea how hard it was to get rid of the last one. The last one? I thought. What are you talking about? I quivered. Never mind that. From now on, you keep these. He didn't have to tell me twice. The whole house is gonna be locked down, and just so we're clear, if you hear me calling your name, it ain't me. What the hell, what else could it be? I opened my mouth to ask a clarifying question. What is it? I said. What's my second rule? My uncle commanded. I pondered for a bit before responding. If I see something, leave it be. That's right. Leave it be. No more of this about it anymore. It will only encourage it. Suddenly, I no longer wanted to go through with my plot to get Uncle Jeremy to send me home. The next morning after breakfast, Uncle Jeremy and I stepped outside to inspect the side of my wall where the noise was coming from. Uncle Jeremy touted a gun belt today, a Magnum revolver in its sheath. When we gazed at the marks on the wall, I was sure that no grizzly had created the noise. These scratches were not random like the ones on the door. No, these markings were indeed a message. Drawn on the wooden logs was a cryptic symbol, a circle with 3 jagged lines drawn through it. On top of this circle were 2 names, Jeremy and Marcus. I gulped as Uncle Jeremy got a closer look. He gave a nervous chuckle. He'll be back tonight? He said in a tone that desired itself to be false. My stomach fluttered in fear. Bessie, the dairy cow, gave an agonizing moo. I could tell that something was bothering her. Uncle Jeremy turned with a sad look on his face. He took to his feet and walked his way over to the cow. When he was feet away from her, he took to one knee. It's already begun. I looked over his shoulder and my mouth dropped when I saw the sight of gore that still torments me to this day. Bessie's udders were mutilated, flesh hanging off of each of the protrusions, and flies feasting on her fresh wounds as blood mixed with fresh milk. Poor Bessie, Uncle Jeremy said. I could tell that seeing his cow suffer made him emotional. I moved to comfort him, but before my hand could grace his shoulder, he stood. He unholstered the Magnum and pointed it at Bessie's head. One shot rang out as every bird in the vicinity took flight. Bessie was dead. She now lay in a pool of blood and brain matter. Uncle Jeremy wiped away some tears before turning around and walking briskly back to the cabin. Come on, kid. We have to get ready. I knew that we were heading for some kind of battle. When the night fell on the cabin that day, Uncle Jeremy and I did not talk. We had barricaded ourselves and all of the livestock inside the little cabin. A total of 22 chickens, 7 goats, and a variety of domesticated geese. He'd thrust a rifle in my hand and give me instructions on how to shoot, though he said not to use it unless something happened to him. For the most part, the night was quiet. The chickens and geese had rusted for the night, and the goats had lost the excitement of being in a new environment. They now huddled together in a corner of the living room. I would almost say it was peaceful, until every animal began screeching at the top of their lungs. The birds flocked around the house. The goats erupted in a panic, running around trying to find any hiding place they could. Most now cowered under the dining room table. Almost as quickly as the commotion began, it all quieted down. I looked at Uncle Jeremy in bewilderment, but the look in his eye told me he'd seen all of this before. His eyes trained on the door. A familiar sound slid across the other side of the door, It was the scratching that we'd heard the night before. In the same fashion, the scratching intensified before it erupted into a frenzy of banging. I eyed the door as the latch struggled to keep whatever was on the other side out. A voice soon followed suit. "Jeremy, Jeremy, Jeremy. Oh, Uncle Jeremy." It sounded like me. For some reason, whatever was on the other side was using my voice to bait my uncle to the door. The voice changed to that of Uncle Jeremy's. "Marcus, open the door, Marcus." Uncle Jeremy looked at me before raising his revolver to the door. One shot rang out, and the sound of something hitting the floor was evident from our vantage point. My uncle took to his feet and made his way over to the door, revolver at the ready. I wanted to tell him to stay put, but couldn't find the courage. He opened the top latch, followed by the bottom. The door cautiously creaked open, and Uncle Jeremy peered out the small crack. I will remember the words that came from his mouth for the rest of my life. "Oh, shit." Suddenly, a clawed hand reached through the small crack in the door and pulled him from the comforts of the cabin. I heard screams, but wasn't sure if they belonged to Uncle Jeremy or the thing impersonating him. Everything went quiet, and I wrestled with the idea of seeing what the outcome of the skirmish was. Just then I heard a voice that brought me a mountain of relief. "It's okay, kid. I got him." I heard Uncle Jeremy grunt as he seemingly took to his feet from the other side of the door. But as the door slowly swung open, my heart dropped. It wasn't my uncle. It was the creature that had taken him. Its body was tall and skinny, its skin pale, and its face, well, it had no face, just a plain identity. But as it stood there and turned in my direction, a mouth began to part, skin sticking to its upper and lower jaws until they eventually gave way to jagged teeth. It spoke one more time in my uncle's voice. "Marcus." It took to a sprint, and when it was just feet from me, a revolver round spat out. The creature flopped to the floor in a green pool of blood. Standing at the door was my injured Uncle Jeremy. For the most part, the night was quiet. The chickens and geese had rusted for the night, and the goats had lost the excitement of being in a new environment. They now huddled together in a corner of the living room. I would almost say it was peaceful, until every animal began screeching at the top of their lungs. The birds flocked around the house. The goats erupted in a panic, running around trying to find any hiding place they could. Most now cowered under the dining room table. Almost as quickly as the commotion began, it all quieted down. I looked at Uncle Jeremy in bewilderment, but the look in his eye told me he'd seen all of this before. His eyes trained on the door. A familiar sound slid across the other side of the door. It was the scratching that we'd heard the night before. In the same fashion, the scratching intensified before it erupted into a frenzy of banging. I eyed the door as the latch struggled to keep whatever was on the other side out. A voice soon followed suit. "Jeremy, Jeremy, Jeremy. Oh, Uncle Jeremy." It sounded like me. For some reason, whatever was on the other side was using my voice to bait my uncle to the door. The voice changed to that of Uncle Jeremy's. "Marcus, open the door, Marcus." Uncle Jeremy looked at me before raising his revolver to the door. One shot rang out, and the sound of something hitting the floor was evident from our vantage point. My uncle took to his feet and made his way over to the door, revolver at the ready. I wanted to tell him to stay put, but couldn't find the courage. He opened the top latch, followed by the bottom. The door cautiously creaked open, and Uncle Jeremy peered out the small crack. I will remember the words that came from his mouth for the rest of my life. Oh, shit. Suddenly, a clawed hand reached through the small crack in the door and pulled him from the comforts of the cabin. I heard screams but wasn't sure if they belonged to Uncle Jeremy or the thing impersonating him. Everything went quiet and I wrestled with the idea of seeing what the outcome of the skirmish was. Just then I heard a voice that brought me a mountain of relief. "It's okay, kid. I got him." I heard Uncle Jeremy grunt as he seemingly took to his feet from the other side of the door. But as the door slowly swung open, my heart dropped. It wasn't my uncle. It was the creature that had taken him. Its body was tall and skinny, its skin pale, and its face, well, it had no face, just a plain identity. But as it stood there and turned in my direction, a mouth began to part, skin sticking to its upper and lower jaws until they eventually gave way to jagged teeth. It spoke one more time in my uncle's voice. "Marcus." It took to a sprint, and when it was just feet from me, a revolver round spat out. The creature flopped to the floor in a green pool of blood. Standing at the door was my injured Uncle Jeremy. This happened back in my freshman year of high school. It was an average school day, just like any other for the most part.